Rain settles in softly, washing the day away with quiet background noise. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds gently and without urgency. Tonight, we explore ancient conspiracies that were actually true, not as shocking revelations, but as slow-moving ideas that quietly shaped the world long before they were understood. Let the rain carry the story at its own pace, and if you'd like, let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening in from. You're standing in a library in 1871, running your fingers along leather-bound volumes that smell of must and possibility. Outside, gaslight flickers against London's fog, but here in this quiet corner you've stumbled upon something that makes your pulse quicken just slightly. A German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann has published claims so outrageous that scholars dismiss them with barely concealed contempt. He insists that Troy, the legendary city from Homer's ancient poems, actually existed as a real place you could visit, touch and excavate from Turkish soil. The academic establishment considers this laughable. Troy belongs to mythology, they insist. No more real than unicorns or dragons. Homer's epic tale served as entertainment, moral instruction perhaps, but certainly not as geographical guidebooks. You can almost hear the scoffing echoes through university halls as professors wave away Schliemann's theories with the same casual dismissal they'd give to claims of Atlantis or El Dorado. But Schliemann possesses something more valuable than academic credentials. He has Homer's text, a fortune from his business ventures, and an unshakable conviction that stories preserve truth. While others read the Iliad as pure fiction, he notices the specific details, the descriptions of landscape features, the mentions of distances between locations, and the careful accounting of geographical markers that seem too precise for pure invention. You follow his journey in your mind's eye. He arrives at a hill called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, where local farmers graze their sheep across what appears to be nothing more than unremarkable terrain. The soil feels ordinary beneath his boots. The wind carries the same salt smell from the nearby Dardanelles Strait that it has carried for thousands of years. Nothing announces itself as extraordinary. Yet he begins to dig. The first days yield pottery shards and broken walls that could belong to any forgotten settlement. The workers he's hired probably wonder about this foreigner's obsession with their dusty hillside, but as the excavation deepens, layers reveal themselves like pages in a book written in soil and stone. Each stratum tells a story of habitation, destruction, and rebuilding. The hill contains not one city but many, stacked atop each other in archaeological succession. When Schliemann's team uncovers fortification walls of massive limestone blocks, fitted together with techniques that speak of significant engineering knowledge, the shape of something magnificent begins to emerge. These aren't the modest remains of a simple farming village. The defensive structures suggest a city that expected attack, that prepared for siege, and that mattered enough to defend with substantial resources. You can imagine running your hands along those ancient stones, feeling the tool marks left by Bronze Age masons who shaped each block with patient precision. The walls curve and angle according to strategic military principles that wouldn't feel out of place in much later fortifications. Someone designed these defences with careful thought about sightlines, defensive positions, and the psychology of attackers facing seemingly impenetrable barriers. The discovery of a massive treasure trove, golden diadems, silver vessels, copper shields, creates an international sensation, though Schliemann's methods of removing these artefacts would make modern archaeologists wince. But the treasure itself matters less than what it represents. Proof that this location housed a wealthy, significant city during exactly the period when Homer's Troy would have flourished. Critics scramble to explain away the findings. Perhaps this is a city, they concede, but surely not the Troy of legend. The connection to Homer's epic remains speculation, they insist, even as more evidence accumulates. The site's location matches Homer's descriptions with eerie accuracy. The strategic importance of controlling the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, explains why such a city would have existed here, and why others might have waged war to control it. As you settle deeper into your imaginary exploration of these discoveries, you realise that Schliemann's vindication teaches something profound about the relationship between story and truth. Legends don't materialise from nothing. They emerge from real events, real places, and real people whose accomplishments impressed their contemporaries so deeply that the tales survived centuries of retelling. The conspiracy wasn't really about Troy's existence. The real hidden truth was that oral traditions and epic poetry could preserve accurate geographical and historical information across vast stretches of time, something that scholarly convention insisted was impossible. Ancient storytellers weren't simply entertaining their audiences with fanciful tales. They were encoding and transmitting genuine knowledge about their world, wrapping facts in narratives so compelling that people would remember and repeat them for generations. Later excavations would reveal even more layers, more complexity, and more confirmation that this site witnessed the rise and fall of significant civilizations. Modern archaeologists, working with better techniques and more careful documentation than Schliemann employed, continue to uncover evidence that makes the connection between this Turkish hillside and Homer's descriptions increasingly difficult to dismiss. You can almost smell the dust of excavation, that particular scent of disturbed earth that hasn't felt sunlight in millennia. The workers' tools scrape against stone and pottery, each sound potentially announcing another revelation. The patient work of archaeology proceeds in careful increments, brushing away dirt to expose what previous generations tried to preserve or simply left behind when circumstances forced them to abandon their homes. The story of Troy's rediscovery reminds you that sometimes the wildest sounding theories deserve serious consideration. The conspiracy theorists of Schliemann's era, those who insisted that legends contained historical kernels worth investigating, turned out to understand something that conventional wisdom missed. Ancient people weren't primitive fabulists. They were sophisticated observers who encoded their knowledge of the world into stories designed to survive. Now you're hiking through dense Peruvian jungle, machete in hand, pushing aside vegetation that seems determined to reclaim every inch of ground from human intrusion. The year is 1915, and you're following rumours that most serious scholars consider beneath their attention. Local people speak of ancient roads running through impossible terrain, connecting distant sites in the Andes with engineering that supposedly rivals anything modern civilization has achieved. The academic consensus dismisses these stories. Yes, the Inca built some impressive structures, experts acknowledge, but the claims about vast road networks spanning thousands of miles strain credulity. The terrain in this part of South America presents challenges that would defeat even contemporary engineers. Mountains rise so steeply that constructing sustained routes seems physically impossible. Jungles grow so thick that maintaining any kind of pathway would require constant, exhausting labour. But Hiram Bingham, the explorer whose footsteps you're retracing, keeps hearing consistent stories from people who live in these mountains. They describe pathways that run from Ecuador to Chile, crossing some of the most hostile landscape on Earth. They mention bridges spanning gorges so deep that you couldn't see the bottom even on the clearest day. They talk about rest stations positioned at precise intervals, allowing travellers to make predictable progress through terrain that should have been impassable. You're climbing now, following what looks like nothing more than a slightly elevated ridge through the forest. Then you notice that the slope beneath your feet feels too consistent, too carefully graded to be natural. Pushing aside centuries of plant growth, your fingers encounter carefully fitted stones, forming a surface designed for travel. The road emerges from its camouflage of vegetation, like a secret revealing itself reluctantly. The construction technique makes you pause in admiration. These builders didn't simply pile stones randomly. They selected each piece for specific characteristics, shape, size, and weight distribution, and fitted them together so precisely that mortar became unnecessary. The road surface drains water effectively, preventing the erosion that would have destroyed lesser construction centuries ago. The grade never exceeds certain limits, suggesting that the engineers understood the relationship between slope and sustainable travel. As you continue following this route, the full scope of the achievement becomes apparent. This isn't a crude path worn by repeated foot traffic. It's an intentionally designed transportation infrastructure that required surveying, planning, and organised labour on a scale that challenges assumptions about pre-Columbian American civilizations. The road adjusts to terrain changes with sophisticated solutions, staircases carved into cliff faces where slopes become too steep, retaining walls preventing landslides, and drainage systems channeling water away from the travel surface. You reach a section where the road clings to a mountainside suspended above a valley floor so far below that it disappears into haze. Looking at the engineering required to create this passage makes you slightly dizzy. Workers would have needed to secure themselves with ropes while chiselling foundations into solid rock. They would have hauled massive stones up slopes that exhaust you even without carrying anything. They achieved this without wheels, without draft animals larger than llamas, and without iron tools to cut through stone. The conspiracy theory that scholars mocked was simple. Indigenous American civilizations had developed sophisticated engineering knowledge and organizational capacity without European influence. The conventional wisdom of the early 20th century couldn't accommodate this possibility. It seemed more reasonable to attribute any impressive pre-Columbian achievements to lost European visitors or even extraterrestrial intervention than to accept that Andean peoples had independently developed advanced technical skills. You're resting now at one of the way stations the locals mentioned. The structure still stands, partially ruined but recognisable, positioned exactly one day's travel from the previous station. The spacing reveals careful planning based on realistic assessments of human endurance in high-altitude conditions. Travellers could rely on finding shelter at predictable intervals, transforming a potentially deadly journey through hostile terrain into a manageable expedition. The road network you're discovering stretches approximately 25,000 miles at its maximum extent, connecting regions as climatically different as tropical coastal areas and frigid mountain passes above 14,000 feet. The Inca didn't merely build paths between nearby settlements. They created an integrated system that united an empire spanning much of western South America, allowing rapid communication, military deployment and economic exchange across distances that would have taken months to traverse through unimproved terrain. Running your hands along the stone surface, worn smooth by countless feet over centuries, you can almost feel the history embedded in these rocks. Messengers called chasqui once sprinted along these routes, carrying information through a relay system that could transmit news faster than seemed physically possible. Armies marched these roads, their footsteps echoing against mountain walls. Merchants transported goods, salt from coastal areas, potatoes from highland farms, and tropical fruits from jungle regions, creating economic integration that wouldn't exist again in South America until the modern era. The bridges prove even more impressive than the roads themselves. The Inca engineers mastered suspension bridge construction, weaving cables from grass fibres that could support significant weight, while spanning distances that stone construction couldn't achieve. You encounter the remains of one such crossing, where anchor points carved into cliff faces once held cables, stretching across a gap that makes your stomach tighten just looking at it. Modern testing of reconstructed Inca bridges reveals engineering principles that wouldn't feel out of place in contemporary textbooks. The cables distribute weight efficiently. The deck design provides stability against wind that whips through these mountain passes with terrifying force. The whole structure flexes rather than resisting movement, allowing it to survive stresses that would snap more rigid constructions. The conspiracy wasn't about roads existing. Every society creates paths between settlements. The hidden truth was that pre-Columbian American civilizations had achieved engineering sophistication that European scholars insisted required knowledge transmitted from the Old World. The roads proved that indigenous peoples had independently developed technical skills, organizational methods, and scientific understanding that conventional wisdom refused to acknowledge. As you continue your journey along these ancient routes, you notice smaller details that reveal the depth of planning involved. The Inca positioned their roads to minimize exposure to landslides and avalanches. They routed paths to take advantage of natural shelter where possible. They created drainage systems that still function after 5 centuries of neglect. Every decision reflected accumulated knowledge about how to build infrastructure that could survive in some of Earth's most challenging environments. You're descending now, following switchbacks that demonstrate another aspect of the engineer's skill. Rather than attempting impossibly steep grades, the road zigzags down the mountainside in a pattern that makes the descent manageable for travellers and cargo carriers. The turns bank slightly, like curves on a modern highway, reducing the risk of losing footing on corners. Even the width of the road varies strategically, wider on straight sections where multiple travellers might pass each other, narrower through difficult terrain where construction costs mattered more than convenience. The discovery of these road networks didn't just reveal impressive engineering, it demonstrated that the Americas before European contact hosted complex organised societies capable of sustained large-scale projects requiring planning across generations. The roads couldn't have been built quickly by small populations. They required centralised authority that could mobilise labour, engineers who could solve technical problems, and societies stable enough to invest resources in infrastructure that might take decades to complete. You're sitting in a monastery library in 16th century Spain, examining manuscripts that monks have carefully preserved from the burning and destruction that followed conquest. The leather-bound pages smell of age and secrets. Outside, the Inquisition's influence still shapes what knowledge people dare to pursue and what questions they risk asking. But here, in this quiet room, you're looking at evidence that challenges everything Europe believes about mathematical sophistication. The documents before you contain Mayan astronomical calculations that predict celestial events with accuracy that European science won't match for centuries. You trace your finger along columns of dots and bars, the elegant Mayan number system that includes a concept European mathematics still struggles to fully embrace. 0 as a placeholder and number in its own right. The conspiracy theory that most Europeans wouldn't accept was straightforward. People in the Americas had independently developed advanced mathematics, astronomy, and calendar systems without any influence from European, Asian, or African civilizations. The conventional wisdom insisted that such sophisticated intellectual achievements must have spread from a single source, presumably somewhere in the Mediterranean or Middle East, because surely humanity couldn't have discovered these concepts multiple times in isolation. But the evidence before you tells a different story. The Mayan number system works in base 20, rather than the base 10 that dominates European counting. This wasn't a primitive choice or a sign of mathematical confusion. It represented a different but equally valid approach to representing quantities, one that actually offers certain advantages for specific types of calculations. You're examining a calendar calculation now, watching how the Mayan system tracks multiple overlapping cycles with precision that makes your head spin slightly. They maintained a sacred calendar of 260 days, a solar calendar of 365 days, and a long count that could track dates across thousands of years. The mathematical sophistication required to keep these systems synchronized while using them for practical purposes, agricultural planning, religious ceremonies, political events, reveals minds as sharp as any in European universities. The astronomical observations prove even more impressive. Mayan mathematicians calculated the lunar month to within seconds of what modern instruments reveal. They predicted solar eclipses with accuracy that European astronomers couldn't match until they gained access to better tools and techniques centuries later. They tracked Venus's movement through the sky so precisely that their calculations remain useful to contemporary astronomers studying that planet's cycles. You can imagine Mayan observers on pyramid platforms watching the night sky with patient attention across generations. They didn't have telescopes, but they had time, dedication, and sophisticated mathematical tools for analysing what they observed. Each generation refined the previous generation's observations, accumulating knowledge that eventually allowed them to predict celestial events years in advance. The conspiracy extended beyond mathematics into writing systems. European scholars initially refused to accept that Mayan glyphs represented a true writing system rather than simple pictographs. The idea that indigenous Americans had independently invented complex written language, complete with phonetic elements, grammatical structures, and the ability to express abstract concepts, contradicted assumptions about the unique brilliance of old world civilizations, but the glyphs clearly functioned as genuine writing. You're looking at a text that records historical events, royal genealogies, and mythological narratives with the same sophistication that Latin or Greek achieved. The writing system combines logographic and phonetic elements, allowing it to represent both concrete objects and abstract ideas with equal facility. Scribes could record sounds, meanings, and subtle grammatical distinctions that turned their language into permanent readable form. The mathematical achievements embedded in Mayan construction provide another layer of evidence. You're examining architectural drawings now, or rather, proportions preserved in surviving structures that reveal the mathematical principles underlying their design. Mayan builders used sophisticated geometry to create buildings aligned to astronomical events. Pyramids oriented so that sunlight creates specific shadow effects during equinoxes. Doorways positioned to frame particular stars at significant dates. The conspiracy theorists of the colonial period, those few Europeans who insisted on taking Mayan intellectual achievements seriously, faced ridicule and professional consequences, acknowledging that people in the Americas had independently developed advanced mathematics and astronomy, challenged theological certainties about human origins and dispersal. It complicated narratives about European cultural superiority. It raised uncomfortable questions about what else indigenous peoples might have discovered that conquest and disease are destroyed before it could be properly documented. You're examining a mathematical text dealing with what we'd call calculus, the mathematics of continuous change. Mayan mathematicians didn't develop this exactly as Europeans would centuries later, but they clearly grasped concepts about tracking changing quantities over time, calculating areas under curves, and understanding accumulation in ways that anticipate later mathematical developments. The zero itself deserves special attention. Mayan mathematicians developed this concept independently, using it both as a placeholder, making positional notation work, and as a number in its own right. European mathematics wouldn't fully embrace zero until well after contact with Arabic mathematical traditions. Yet here it functions naturally in a system developed in complete isolation from old world influences. You can almost hear the scratch of a Mayan scribe's brush against paper made from tree bark, carefully recording calculations that would preserve astronomical knowledge for future generations. The concentration required for this work and the understanding that you're contributing to an accumulating body of knowledge that transcends individual lifetimes creates a connection across centuries. Those scribes knew they were building something that mattered, preserving discoveries that took generations to accumulate. The architectural evidence speaks to practical applications of this mathematical knowledge. Mayan builders created structures that still stand centuries after construction, despite earthquakes, hurricanes, and the weight of jungle vegetation trying to pull them down. The proportions of these buildings reflect a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, load distribution, and the relationship between form and function. You're studying the remains of an astronomical observatory now, or what scholars have identified as such based on alignments that couldn't have occurred by chance. The structure tracks solar and lunar cycles with precision that required both mathematical sophistication and patient observation across many years. The builders positioned windows and doorways to frame specific celestial events, turning architecture into a permanent record of astronomical knowledge. The conspiracy wasn't just about mathematics existing in isolation from European influence. The deeper hidden truth was that human intelligence developed sophisticated solutions to complex problems wherever people have time, resources, and motivation to pursue knowledge systematically. The Mayan mathematical achievements demonstrated that intellectual advancement doesn't require specific cultural lineages or divine inspiration limited to particular regions. It emerges from human capacity to observe patterns, test ideas, and build on previous generations' discoveries. You're walking through a rainforest in the Amazon basin, your boots squelching through mud that smells of decomposition and growth occurring simultaneously. The air wraps around you like a warm, damp blanket carrying 1,000 different plant scents. Indigenous guides lead you to trees and vines that European-trained doctors insist couldn't possibly contain the medicinal properties that local people claim. The medical establishment in the early 20th century maintains firm positions about indigenous knowledge. Native peoples might have stumbled upon a few useful plants through trial and error, doctors acknowledge grudgingly. but the sophisticated pharmacological understanding they claim seems implausible. Real medicine requires laboratory research, controlled testing, and scientific rigour that supposedly couldn't exist in cultures without formal academic institutions, but your guides demonstrate knowledge that makes you question these dismissive assumptions. They identify specific plants for particular ailments with confidence born from generations of careful observation. They explain preparation methods, which parts of a plant to use, how to extract active compounds, and what dosages prove effective without causing harm. They discuss contraindications and interactions between different medicines with the same careful attention to detail that European pharmacists claim as their exclusive domain. You're examining cinchona bark now, the source of quinine that European doctors reluctantly admitted could treat malaria after centuries of indigenous use in South America. Your guide explains how our ancestors identified this particular tree species among thousands in the forest, how they discovered that bark from specific elevations proved more effective than others, and how they developed extraction techniques that maximize the active compound's concentration. The conspiracy theory that medical professionals refused to accept was that indigenous peoples had developed genuine pharmacological knowledge through systematic observation and experimentation. The conventional wisdom insisted that effective medicine required written records, formal education, and scientific methodology that supposedly didn't exist in oral cultures. Therefore, any effective indigenous remedies must represent lucky accidents rather than true medical science. But the evidence suggests otherwise. You're learning about ayahuasca now, not the recreational substance that would later attract tourists, but the medicinal compound that indigenous healers developed for specific therapeutic purposes. The preparation requires combining two plants that separately don't produce the desired effects. Together, they create a substance whose mechanism of action involves chemical interactions that European pharmacology couldn't fully explain for decades after Western scientists first encountered it. The sophistication required to discover this combination makes your head spin slightly. The Amazon contains approximately 80,000 plant species. The probability of randomly combining these two specific plants in the right proportions seems astronomically small. Yet indigenous healers not only made this discovery, but also understood the conditions under which the medicine worked most effectively, who should receive it and who shouldn't, and how to manage the experience to achieve therapeutic rather than merely disorienting effects. You can imagine the generations of careful observation this knowledge required. Someone noticed that particular plants produce specific effects. Others experimented with different preparations, different combinations, and different dosages. Knowledge accumulated as people compared experiences, refined techniques, and developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how these medicines interacted with human physiology. The guides are showing you wound treatment techniques now using plants that prevent infection with effectiveness that European medicine wouldn't match until antibiotics became available in the mid-20th century. They explain how to identify the right plants even when they're not flowering, how to prepare poultices that prevent bacterial growth, and how to assess whether a wound requires additional intervention beyond botanical treatment. The conspiracy extended to surgical knowledge. Indigenous peoples in several regions performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or treat head injuries, with survival rates that wouldn't shame modern neurosurgery. Archaeological evidence shows healed skulls demonstrating that patients survived these procedures and recovered sufficiently for bone to regrow around the surgical opening. This requires understanding of sterility, pain management, and post-operative care that supposedly didn't exist outside European medical traditions. You're examining coca leaves now, which your guide chews to manage altitude sickness during mountain travel. She explains the difference between traditional use of the leaf, which provides mild stimulation and altitude adaptation, and concentrated extraction that creates problematic compounds. The knowledge embedded in this distinction reveals a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology. Indigenous peoples recognize that route of administration, dosage, and preparation method all affect a substance's impact on human physiology. The medical knowledge encompasses more than just pharmaceutical plants. You're learning about dietary treatments for specific conditions, physical therapy techniques for injuries, and mental health interventions that modern psychology is only beginning to appreciate. Indigenous healers understood that treating patients required addressing physical, psychological and social dimensions of illness simultaneously, a holistic approach that Western medicine would eventually rediscover and rebrand as integrative healthcare. The guides discuss diagnostic techniques that involve observing subtle signs that European-trained doctors would dismiss as superstition, but when you watch carefully, you notice they're tracking real physiological indicators, changes in skin colour that suggest circulatory problems, alterations in breathing patterns that indicate respiratory issues, and behavioural shifts that signal neurological concerns. They've simply developed observational skills so refined that their conclusions seem intuitive rather than analytical. You can almost smell the bitter alkaloids in the plant your guide is preparing now, explaining its use for digestive complaints. The preparation involves specific timing, harvesting at particular seasons, processing within certain timeframes, and storing under controlled conditions. This level of detail demonstrates empirical testing across generations, careful documentation through oral tradition, and systematic knowledge accumulation that deserves recognition as genuine scientific methodology, even if it didn't involve written records or laboratory equipment. The conspiracy wasn't about whether indigenous peoples used plants as medicine. Even the most dismissive European doctors acknowledged that much. The hidden truth was that indigenous cultures had developed sophisticated medical knowledge through rigorous observation and testing, creating pharmacological understanding that rivaled and sometimes exceeded what European science had achieved through supposedly superior academic methods. You're standing on a dock in the Mediterranean, watching divers prepare equipment for an expedition that most archaeologists consider a waste of time and resources. The year is 1953, and conventional wisdom insists that underwater archaeology represents a contradiction in terms. Anything truly important wouldn't have ended up at the bottom of the sea, experts argue, and even if significant artefacts did sink, the saltwater environment would have destroyed them centuries ago. But the divers preparing to descend don't share this pessimism. They've heard stories from sponge fishermen and local sailors about shipwrecks containing amphorae, the clay jars ancient peoples used for transporting wine, oil and other goods. These humble containers might reveal information about ancient trade routes, economic systems, and cultural connections that written records never captured because they seem too mundane to document. You watch as the first diver disappears beneath the surface, following bubbles that mark his descent. The water here is remarkably clear, allowing visibility that makes underwater exploration feasible if not exactly comfortable. Minutes pass with the peculiar slowness that waiting always creates. Then the diver surfaces, excitement evident even through his breathing apparatus. He's found something, not just scattered pottery shards, but an organised shipwreck with cargo still arranged as it was when the vessel sank perhaps 2,000 years ago. The conspiracy theory that underwater exploration would eventually prove was that ancient maritime trade operated on a much larger scale than historical records suggested. Conventional wisdom held that ancient shipping was limited, risky, and confined to coastal waters where sailors could keep land in sight. The idea that regular trade routes crisscrossed the Mediterranean, that ships routinely carried massive cargoes across open water, that maritime commerce formed the backbone of ancient economies, all this seemed like romantic exaggeration rather than historical fact, but the shipwrecks tell a different story. You're examining the first recovery now, a bronze statue so perfectly preserved by the marine environment that it looks like it could have been submerged last week rather than millennia ago. The copper in the alloy created chemical conditions that prevented bacterial degradation. The statue spent 2,000 years at the bottom of the sea and emerged in better condition than bronzes that survived above ground, exposed to air, water cycles, and human handling. The cargo itself reveals the scope of ancient trade. This single ship carried wine from one region, olive oil from another, and manufactured goods from a third location. The amphorae bear stamps identifying their origins, creating a map of commercial connections that stretched across the entire Mediterranean world. Some jars travelled thousands of miles from their production sites, suggesting regular trade routes that connected diverse cultures in sustained economic relationships. You're diving now yourself, following the archaeologists who are mapping the wreck site with careful precision. The ship's remains rest on the seabed like a time capsule, preserving a moment from ancient commerce. The wooden hull is mostly decayed, but the cargo that survived shows you how merchants organised their vessels, heavy items low in the hold for stability, fragile goods packed with protective materials, everything arranged to maximise the space, available while maintaining seaworthiness. The conspiracy extended beyond simple trade routes. Underwater archaeology revealed that ancient peoples built harbour facilities far more sophisticated than textual sources suggested. You're swimming over the remains of a Roman port now, seeing underwater construction that demonstrates advanced engineering knowledge. Stone blocks fitted together with waterproof cement, breakwaters positioned to protect ships from storms, and mooring systems designed for vessels much larger than the modest craft that historical accounts described. The preservation underwater often exceeds what survives on land. Organic materials that would have rotted away in terrestrial conditions, wood, rope, and leather, remain intact enough to study their construction. You're examining wooden parts of the ship's hull that show the techniques ancient shipwrights used to create vessels capable of crossing open water while carrying enormous loads. The planking reveals a sophisticated understanding of how wood flexes under stress, how to join pieces to create waterproof seams, and how to design hulls that balance cargo capacity against sailing performance. The hidden truth that underwater archaeology exposed was that ancient maritime technology was far more advanced than conventional histories acknowledged. Ships didn't simply hug coastlines, limiting themselves to short journeys with frequent stops. Navigators developed techniques for crossing open water using celestial navigation, seasonal wind patterns, and accumulated knowledge about currents and weather. Shipbuilders created vessels that could survive storms powerful enough to sink modern craft. Merchants established trade networks that functioned with impressive efficiency despite the absence of modern communication technology. You're surfacing now, lungs grateful for fresh air after breathing through the apparatus underwater. The afternoon sun sparkles on wavelets, and you can see the support vessel, where archaeologists are cataloguing the morning's discoveries. Each artifact recovered tells part of a larger story about ancient commerce, about the movement of goods, ideas, and people across distances that supposedly represented impossible barriers to regular contact. The ships themselves demonstrate technological sophistication that rewrites understanding of ancient capabilities. You're examining technical drawings now based on hull remains recovered from multiple wrecks. The designs incorporate principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until the age of sail. Hull shapes that minimize drag, keel configurations that improve stability, and rigging systems that allow sailing against the wind through careful tacking. Later discoveries would reveal even more impressive finds. Ships carrying bronze computers, the Antikythera mechanism, that demonstrated mechanical sophistication centuries ahead of what historians thought possible. Wrecks from the Bronze Age containing tin from Cornwall and amber from the Baltic, proving that trade routes spanned Europe millennia before written records documented such connections. Underwater cities show that ancient peoples built permanent structures in shallow marine environments, creating harbour facilities that served as commercial hubs for centuries. The conspiracy wasn't about denying that ancient peoples travelled by sea. Everyone acknowledged that much. The hidden truth was that maritime technology, navigation knowledge, and commercial organisation had reached levels of sophistication that challenged narratives about primitive ancients, slowly developing capabilities that modern societies perfected. Ancient mariners weren't cautious coastal sailors making tentative journeys along familiar shores. They were confident navigators who crossed open water regularly, carrying commercial cargoes that sustained complex economic systems spanning entire seas. You're in a map collection in Istanbul, carefully unrolling a document that cartography experts insist must be a fraud or a curiosity rather than evidence of anything historically significant. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, shows details of coastlines that European explorers supposedly hadn't discovered yet. But what really makes scholars uncomfortable is how accurate it appears in places where accuracy shouldn't have been possible. With the tools and knowledge available to 16th century cartographers, The conspiracy theory that makes the academic establishment so uncomfortable is simple. Ancient civilizations possessed geographical knowledge far more extensive than conventional histories acknowledge. Someone, somewhere, had accurately mapped coastlines, and perhaps even portions of continents that Europeans wouldn't officially explore for centuries. This knowledge somehow survived. Fragmentary, corrupted, but recognizable, in maps that later cartographers created using sources they claimed derived from antiquity. You're examining Antarctica's coastline on the Piri Reis map now. The shape matches the land underneath the ice sheets with unsettling accuracy. Land that modern science didn't map until the mid-20th century, using sonar and ice-penetrating radar. How could a 16th century Ottoman admiral have depicted this coastline as it appeared before glaciation? The conventional explanation that it's a distorted representation of South America's coast doesn't quite satisfy when you look at the specific features that seem to match subglacial Antarctica. The map contains notes explaining that Piri Reis compiled it from approximately 20 source maps, some of which he claimed dated to the time of Alexander the Great. Most historians dismiss this claim as exaggeration or misunderstanding, but the accuracy of certain sections makes you wonder what those source materials actually showed. You're studying the African coastline now, traced with precision that European navigators supposedly didn't achieve until after decades of exploration and surveying. The rivers appear in correct positions. The coastal features match reality more closely than maps that European sources created during the same period. Someone clearly had better information about African geography than official exploration records suggest should have been available. The conspiracy extends to other maps from the same general period. You're examining the Orontius Phineus map from 1531 now, which shows Antarctica centred at the South Pole with a remarkably accurate shape and size, again depicting the continent as it would appear without ice coverage. The mountain ranges correspond to subglacial features that modern geology identifies through methods unavailable to Renaissance cartographers. The conventional explanations for these maps feel increasingly strained the more you study them. Yes, cartographers sometimes copied errors from previous maps, creating persistent inaccuracies. Yes, mapmakers occasionally invented features to fill empty spaces, but the specific accuracies, the precise positions of geographical features that remained unknown to European explorers, suggest something more interesting than random luck or artistic license. You can imagine ancient mariners carefully recording coastlines as they explored, creating charts that later generations copied and recopied, introducing errors while preserving enough accurate detail that Renaissance cartographers could create surprisingly precise composite maps. Perhaps Phoenician sailors ranged farther than classical sources recorded. Perhaps Polynesian navigators shared geographical knowledge with traders who carried it westward. Perhaps civilizations that left no written records nevertheless mapped their discoveries with sufficient skill that fragments survived into historical periods. The hidden truth isn't necessarily that ancient explorers circumnavigated the globe, or that lost civilizations possessed technology rivaling modern capabilities. The conspiracy that conventional wisdom couldn't accept was simpler. Human geographical knowledge before European exploration was far more extensive than the historical record preserves, and this knowledge survived in fragmentary form through oral, traditions, copied maps, and cultural memory that official histories dismissed as legend. You're examining Chinese maps now, showing maritime routes across the Indian Ocean that supposedly didn't exist before European contact, but the detail suggests regular travel between Asia and Africa, established trade routes, and geographical knowledge accumulated across centuries of navigation. The maps contain practical information, locations of harbours, notation of dangerous reefs, indication of seasonal wind patterns that only comes from actual experience sailing these waters repeatedly. The Polynesian navigators provide perhaps the most convincing evidence that pre-modern peoples achieved geographical knowledge on par with anything European exploration accomplished. Their maps, made from sticks and shells, encoding information about currents, wave patterns, and island locations, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of ocean navigation. They crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific, settling islands from Hawaii to Easter Island to New Zealand. using navigational techniques that didn't require written records or complex instruments, but nevertheless worked with impressive reliability. You're sitting in a university library on a quiet evening, watching the last sunlight fade from windows that overlook a campus much changed from its founding centuries. Around you, books contain knowledge that was once lost, then recovered, then sometimes lost again before finally finding secure homes in academic institutions that preserve and share it. The story of how humanity rediscovered forgotten truths creates its own narrative of persistence, curiosity, and the slow accumulation of understanding. The pattern repeats across civilizations and centuries. Knowledge emerges through careful observation and testing. Disasters, natural or human-caused, destroy the institutions that preserve this knowledge. Fragments survive in odd places. Copies that scholars saved, oral traditions that communities maintained, and practical applications that people continued using, even after theoretical understanding disappeared. Eventually someone notices the fragments, recognizes their significance, and begins the patient work of reconstructing what was lost. You're reading about the recovery of Greek mathematical and philosophical texts now, how Islamic scholars preserved works that Christian Europe had lost or destroyed during chaotic periods following Rome's collapse. These scholars didn't merely preserve the texts, they added their own commentaries and discoveries, advancing knowledge that European institutions would later reclaim and develop further. The transmission of knowledge followed complex paths, crossing cultural and religious boundaries, surviving periods when certain ideas seemed dangerous or irrelevant to the societies that held them. The rediscovery of ancient medical knowledge followed similar patterns. You're examining a medieval manuscript now that shows surgical techniques derived from Roman sources, but preserved through Arabic translation. The original Latin texts had been lost when libraries burned, when monasteries dissolved, and when warfare scattered collections that represented centuries of accumulated learning. But the knowledge survived its wanderings, eventually returning to European medical practice enriched by the contributions of every culture it passed through. The conspiracy that conventional wisdom resisted was that knowledge doesn't develop linearly, always advancing, never retreating. Understanding accumulates, but it also disappears. Civilizations achieve sophisticated insights, then lose them when circumstances change. Other societies independently develop similar ideas, or they recover lost knowledge from fragments that survive destruction. The actual history of human learning involves advances, retreats, parallel development, recovery, and synthesis in patterns far more complex than simple narratives of progressive improvement. You can feel the weight of all these books around you, each one containing knowledge that someone fought to preserve, that survived periods when it seemed destined for permanent loss, and that returned to human awareness through persistence and often accident. The library represents not just current understanding, but the accumulated effort of countless individuals who believed knowledge mattered enough to protect, copy, translate, and transmit despite obstacles and dangers. The environmental wisdom of indigenous peoples provides another example of lost and recovered knowledge. You're reading ecological studies now that confirm practices indigenous communities maintained for centuries, controlled burning that prevents catastrophic wildfires, crop rotation systems that preserve soil fertility, and water management techniques that sustain agriculture in marginal environments. For generations, European agricultural science dismissed these practices as primitive. Then, ecological research revealed that they embodied sophisticated understanding of ecosystem dynamics, often proving more sustainable than the methods that replaced them. The recovery continues in your own time. Archaeologists keep finding evidence that requires revising historical narratives. Linguists decode writing systems that preserve knowledge from cultures that disappeared. Scientists discover that traditional medicines contain compounds with genuine therapeutic value. Each discovery confirms that human achievement extends deeper into the past than any single generation realizes, and that knowledge develops in more places and times than conventional histories acknowledge. You're thinking about the Antikythera mechanism now, the ancient Greek computing device recovered from a shipwreck, showing that mechanical sophistication existed centuries before historians thought such technology possible. For decades after its recovery, Scholars couldn't explain how it worked. The device sat in museums, recognised as important but not understood, until modern imaging technology allowed detailed examination of its gears and mechanisms. Even then, recreating it required sophisticated engineering knowledge, demonstrating that ancient craftspeople possessed skills that their society valued enough to support, but not to document in texts that survived. The pattern teaches humility. Every generation thinks it understands the past, that it knows what ancient peoples could and couldn't achieve and what knowledge they possessed or lacked. Then new discoveries arrive, forcing revisions, revealing that the past was more complex, more sophisticated, and more interesting than simplified narratives suggested. The conspiracy theorists who insisted that ancient peoples deserved more credit than conventional wisdom granted often proved correct, though sometimes for reasons different than they imagined. As you prepare to leave the library, you notice the comfortable weight of knowledge accumulated around you. These books, these preserved fragments of human learning, represent victories against entropy and chaos. Someone cared enough to write this information down. Others preserved it when easier options involved letting it disappear. Still others translated, transmitted, and eventually printed it in forms that could survive across centuries and continents. The knowledge available to you represents countless small acts of preservation, each one affirming that understanding matters, that truth deserves protection, and that the effort to maintain and transmit knowledge serves purposes more important than any individual lifetime. The slow rediscovery continues. Somewhere tonight someone is examining evidence that will revise understanding of what ancient peoples achieved. Somewhere, a fragment of lost knowledge is being decoded, translated, or recognized for its significance. The conspiracy theories that turned out to be true remind you that healthy skepticism about conventional wisdom serves truth better than unquestioned acceptance of what authorities claim. The past keeps revealing itself to be more sophisticated, more accomplished, and more interesting than any single narrative can fully capture. You're walking home now through evening air that carries hints of approaching autumn. Above you, stars shine with the same light that ancient astronomers observed, mapped, and predicted with tools that seemed impossibly primitive yet somehow worked. The Mayan mathematicians were seeing these same constellations, calculating their movements with precision that rivals modern instruments. The Polynesian navigators used these stars to cross oceans, encoding knowledge in songs and sticks and stories that European science initially dismissed as primitive. The ancient engineers whose roads and cities and harbours still function centuries after their creators died, proving that sophistication doesn't require the specific technologies that our era takes for granted. The real lesson isn't that ancient peoples possessed mysterious lost technology or secret knowledge that modern science hasn't rediscovered. The conspiracy theories that turned out to be true teach something subtler. Human intelligence, given time and motivation, develops sophisticated solutions to complex problems, regardless of specific cultural circumstances. Knowledge accumulates wherever people pay attention to their environment, test their ideas against reality, and pass their discoveries to future generations. The diversity of human achievement across cultures and centuries demonstrates that there are many paths to understanding, many methods that work, and many ways of being sophisticated that conventional wisdom in any particular era might fail to recognize or appreciate. You're home now, settling into familiar comfort with the satisfaction of a journey completed. The stories you've travelled through tonight, lost cities that weren't myths, ancient knowledge that deserved respect, civilizations that achieved more than history's initially credited, remind you that reality often proves more interesting than either skeptics or enthusiasts imagine. The truth resides somewhere between absolute dismissal and uncritical acceptance, in the patient work of examining evidence, revising theories, and acknowledging when conventional wisdom needs updating. As you drift towards sleep, you're thinking about all the knowledge still waiting to be recovered, all the evidence not yet discovered, and all the conventional wisdom that future generations will revise as they uncover truths that this era's conspiracies only hint at. The investigation continues, as it always has, as it always will. Somewhere someone is examining a fragment of the past that will eventually reshape understanding of human achievement. The slow work of rediscovery proceeds. one careful observation at a time, building toward insights that won't fully emerge for years or decades, but that will eventually add to the accumulated understanding that each generation inherits, revises, and passes along. The past remains alive in its influence on the present, in the knowledge that survived to shape current understanding, and in the mysteries that still wait for explanation. The conspiracy theories that prove true remind you that humility about what you think you know serves truth better than certainty. The human story keeps revealing itself to be more complex, more accomplished, and more surprising than any simplified narrative can capture, and that complexity, that persistent ability of the past to surprise and teach, provides its own quiet comfort as you settle into rest, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to learn, revise, and appreciate the sophisticated achievements of people who came before, people whose names are lost but whose discoveries, encoded in monuments and maps and mathematical systems, continue to speak across the centuries if you're willing to listen carefully to what they're saying. Sweet dreams, my friends. Imagine you're sitting around humanity's first controlled fire maybe 400,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. You're not quite a modern human yet. Your brow ridge is more pronounced, your posture slightly different. But your brain is asking the same questions humans still ask today. What is this? How does it work? And most importantly, how can I use this to make my life better? The fire itself was already miraculous enough. Your ancestors had watched lightning strikes for generations and seen the devastating and cleansing power of wildfire. But now they could carry this elemental force in their hands, feed it, control it, and make it dance to human rhythms. The warmth alone would have been revolutionary, transforming caves from cold stone chambers into something approaching homes. But then something unexpected happened. Someone, let's call her the world's first accidental aromatherapist, threw some green wood onto the fire. Maybe it was wet sage or pine boughs, or some resinous branch that hadn't dried properly. The smoke that rose wasn't the usual grey plume. This smoke was thick and aromatic, and when it drifted past someone's face, something changed. You have to understand that these early humans had no context for what we'd call relaxation or stress relief. Life was an endless cycle of hunting, gathering, avoiding predators, and trying not to die from infected wounds or bad weather. The concept of deliberately calming yourself would have seemed as alien as quantum physics. But when that fragrant smoke passed by, muscles that had been tense for days suddenly loosened. Minds that had been vigilantly scanning for danger found themselves drifting into something approaching peace. It probably took generations to connect the dots. Fire plus certain plants equals feeling different. But humans are pattern recognition machines, and eventually someone noticed that burning juniper made the cave smell clean and left people feeling lighter. Burning certain resins made everyone drowsy and content. Burning others seemed to sharpen the mind or lift the spirits. These early experiments weren't written down. Writing wouldn't be invented for hundreds of thousands of years, but they were passed down through demonstration and experience. The knowledge became embedded in human culture so deeply that by the time we invented writing, smoking various substances for various effects was already an ancient practice. The interesting thing is that this discovery was almost certainly made independently in dozens of different locations around the world. Humans in Africa, Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas all figured out that smoke could be more than just a byproduct of fire. It could be a tool, a medicine, a pathway to altered states of consciousness, or simply a moment of relief in otherwise relentless lives. Consider the sensory experience for these early humans. They lived in a world that was simultaneously more vivid and more limited than ours. No artificial lights meant that fire was the only thing holding back absolute darkness. No processed foods meant every meal was an adventure in wild flavours, and no air pollution meant that the smell of burning herbs was a profound departure from the normal sense of earth, animals, and unwashed humans. When aromatic smoke filled a cave, it transformed the space entirely. The flickering firelight would make the smoke visible as it rose and swirled, creating patterns that human eyes, evolved to spot predators and prey, couldn't help but follow. The smell would announce itself immediately, overwhelming the cave's normal odours with something intentional and controlled. And the taste, because smell and taste are intimately connected, would linger on the tongue, a reminder that this moment was different from normal moments. Some of these early smoke experiments probably went badly. Certain plants, when burned, produced toxic fumes that caused nausea, headaches, or worse. There must have been countless trial and error incidents that ended with everyone stumbling out of a cave, gasping for fresh air and wondering why their ancestors had recommended burning that particular plant. But the successes, those plants that produced pleasant, calming or consciousness-altering smoke, those got remembered and repeated. By the time humans were anatomically modern, roughly 300,000 years ago, the knowledge of smoke and its effects was already an established part of human culture. Archaeological evidence shows that even Neanderthals, our close cousins who died out around 40,000 years ago, used aromatic plants deliberately. We've found traces of medicinal herbs in their teeth, suggesting they were either eating them or breathing their smoke for therapeutic purposes. This wasn't superstition or primitive ignorance. These early humans were conducting empirical experiments with their own consciousness, discovering that certain substances could reliably produce specific effects. They were, in their way, the world's first pharmacologists, working without laboratories or double-blind studies, but with a deep intuitive understanding of how plants and human bodies interact. The smoke itself became a teacher. Watch how it rises, always seeking the sky, never moving straight but dancing in response to air currents too subtle for human senses to detect. See how it gathers along the cave ceiling, creating a visible layer between earth and stone. Notice how it clings to hair and clothing, marking those who sat closest to the fire with a lingering reminder of the experience. These observations would later become metaphors and spiritual concepts. Smoke rises like prayers. Smoke connects earth to sky. Smoke transforms solid matter into something ethereal and temporary. But before the metaphors came the simple, physical reality. Burning certain things produces smoke that makes you feel different. And feeling different can be exactly what you need. Fast forward several 100,000 years, humans have invented agriculture, built cities, developed writing systems, and created the first civilizations. We're now in the ancient world of temples and priests, of organized religion and institutionalized ritual. And smoke, our old friend from the cave, has become absolutely central to how humans interact with the divine. Picture yourself in an ancient Egyptian temple around 2000 BCE. You've been awake since before dawn, preparing for a ceremony that will honour the gods and, hopefully, secure their blessings for the coming harvest. The temple itself is a marvel. Massive stone columns carved with hieroglyphs, painted in colours that would seem garish by modern standards, but that shimmer beautifully in lamplight. But what hits you first, before you even enter the inner sanctuary, is the smell. Incense has been burning in this temple for hours, maybe days. The priests know that the sacred space must be properly prepared, and preparation means filling the air with fragrance so thick you can almost see it. The ancient Egyptians took their incense seriously. And by seriously, I mean they built an entire economic system around it. They imported frankincense and myrrh from the mysterious land of Punt, probably modern Somalia or Yemen, paying enormous sums for resins that were literally worth their weight in gold. The famous reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show Queen Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt, bringing back living myrrh trees like botanical trophies. Why this obsession with aromatic smoke? The practical answer is that temples were located in hot climates, filled with animal sacrifices and attended by crowds of people who bathed less frequently than we do. Incense was, among other things, the ancient world's most sophisticated air freshener. But that's only part of the story. The Egyptians believed that fragrant smoke was literally food for the gods. When they burned incense before a statue of Ra or Osiris, they weren't just creating a pleasant atmosphere. They were providing sustenance to divine beings who existed in a realm beyond human senses. The smoke rising from the censer was a bridge between worlds, carrying prayers and offerings to places humans couldn't reach. The physical effect of this constant incense burning would have been significant. Ancient temples used frankincense, myrrh, styrax, and other resins that we now know contain psychoactive compounds. Frankincense, for instance, contains tetrahydrocannabinol and other chemicals that can produce mild euphoria and reduce anxiety when burned in enclosed spaces. Stand in a temple filled with frankincense smoke for hours, and you're going to feel different, calmer, more contemplative, perhaps more receptive to spiritual experiences. The priests understood this, even if they couldn't explain it in modern pharmacological terms. They knew that the right combination of incense, chanting, drumming, and ritual could induce states of consciousness that felt like communication with the divine. Whether these states actually involved supernatural contact or were simply altered brain chemistry is almost beside the point. The experience was real, profound, and reliably reproducible. Now travel west to ancient Greece, around 500 BCE. You're at the Oracle of Delphi, that famous sanctuary where priestesses delivered prophecies that kings and generals would stake their fortunes on. The oracle sits in a small chamber built over a geological fault, and modern researchers have discovered something fascinating. That fault releases ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling substance that produces euphoria and dissociative states in moderate concentrations. The Greeks didn't know about ethylene chemistry, but they certainly knew that the Pythia, the priestess who served as the oracle, would breathe deeply from the vapours rising from the earth, then enter a trance state during which she would speak the words of Apollo. They burned additional substances, laurel leaves, barley and other materials, to enhance the effect and create an atmosphere thick with smoke and mystery. You can imagine standing in that sacred precinct, waiting your turn to consult the oracle. The smell of burning laurel fills your nostrils, sharp, slightly medicinal, strangely compelling. The Pythia's attendants maintain the fires, adding more leaves when the smoke begins to thin. The whole process has been refined over centuries to produce maximum psychological and pharmacological effect. When the Pythia finally speaks, her words are often cryptic and ambiguous, famously so. But in that smoke-filled chamber, with your own consciousness slightly altered by the atmospheric compounds you've been breathing, those ambiguous words seem pregnant with meaning. Your mind makes connections, sees patterns, and finds significance that might not survive exposure to clear air and sober reflection. The Romans, practical as always, took incense culture and industrialized it. They imported so much frankincense and myrrh that the trade routes carrying these materials became some of the most important economic arteries of the ancient world. Roman temples burned incense constantly, not just during special ceremonies, but as a regular offering to maintain good relations with the gods. But Romans also recognized the secular uses of aromatic smoke. Wealthy households burned incense to mask unpleasant odors and create an atmosphere of luxury. Roman physicians like Galen and Dioscorides wrote extensively about the medicinal properties of different incenses, recommending specific substances for specific conditions. Headache? Try burning willow bark. Anxiety? Chamomile smoke. Insomnia? Valerian or poppy. The censers themselves, those ornate metal containers designed to burn incense, became works of art. Some were simple clay bowls, others were elaborate bronze constructions with chains for carrying, perforated lids to control airflow, and decorative elements that showed exactly how important incense had become to Mediterranean culture. Across the Mediterranean in ancient Judea, incense played a central role in temple worship. The Book of Exodus describes a specific incense recipe: stacte, onycha, galbanum, and frankincense, mixed in precise proportions, that was so sacred that making it for any purpose other than temple worship was punishable by exile. The cloud of incense smoke in the temple's Holy of Holies was thought to veil the very presence of God, making the divine bearable to human eyes. This period, roughly 3000 BCE to 500 CE, represents the high water mark of institutional incense culture in the ancient world. Smoke had evolved from a cave discovery to a cornerstone of religious practice, from an accidental finding to a deliberate technology for altering consciousness and creating sacred space. While priests were burning incense in temples, another group of professionals was discovering that smoke could heal the body as directly as it elevated the spirit. The ancient physicians, those observers of human suffering who combined empirical observation with theoretical frameworks that seem both sophisticated and charmingly wrong by modern standards, developed an entire branch of therapeutics based on inhaling medicinal smoke. Let's visit ancient China around 200 BCE. You're suffering from a persistent cough that's been keeping you awake at night, and your family has finally scraped together enough money to consult a physician. He's a learned man who has studied the classics, understands the flow of qi through the body, and has access to the accumulated medical wisdom of centuries. After examining your tongue, checking your pulse at several points, and asking detailed questions about your diet and daily routine, he nods thoughtfully. The problem, he explains, is an imbalance of energies in your lungs, complicated by excess dampness. The treatment requires a careful combination of approaches, but one element will be therapeutic smoke. The physician produces a small bundle of dried herbs, mahuang, ephedra, some dried mulberry leaf, and other materials you don't recognize. He instructs you to burn these over charcoal and breathe the resulting smoke deeply, 3 times per day, always facing east in the morning and west in the evening. The ritual specification isn't arbitrary. Chinese medicine viewed the body as intimately connected to cosmic patterns, and timing treatments to align with daily cycles was thought to enhance their effectiveness. The herbs he's prescribed actually work, though not for the reasons he believes. Mahuang contains ephedrine, a bronchodilator that opens airways and makes breathing easier. The other herbs have antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties that would genuinely help a respiratory infection. The act of deliberately slowing your breathing to inhale the smoke probably helps too, inducing a relaxation response that reduces stress-related coughing. The Chinese weren't alone in developing smoke-based therapeutics. In ancient India, Ayurvedic physicians created elaborate systems of dhumapana, therapeutic smoking. The Sushruta Samhita, a medical text composed around 600 BCE, describes specific herbs to be smoked for specific conditions. Asthma, try a mixture that includes cannabis and datura. Mental disturbances, different combinations of aromatic woods and resins. Even hiccups had their own prescribed smoke treatment. These Ayurvedic physicians understood something important. Different substances produce different effects depending on how they're consumed. Cannabis eaten as food produces one set of effects. The same plant smoked produces different, faster-acting results. This wasn't superstition, it was practical pharmacology based on careful observation. The Greeks and Romans also incorporated therapeutic smoking into their medical practice. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, described using smoke inhalation to treat gynecological problems. His reasoning was based on the theory that the uterus could wander through the body, a delightfully wrong idea called the wandering womb, and strong-smelling smoke would drive it back to its proper position. The theory was nonsense, but some of the herbs he recommended had genuine anti-inflammatory or muscle-relaxing properties that probably provided actual relief. Galen, probably the most influential physician of the ancient world, wrote extensively about smoke therapeutics. He distinguished between different types of smoke based on their properties, hot or cold, wet or dry, subtle or thick. A physician needed to match the qualities of the therapeutic smoke to the imbalance in the patient's body. Too much heat in the lungs. Use cooling smoke from cucumber seeds or lettuce. Too much cold. Warming smoke from pepper or mustard. The interesting thing is that many of these ancient smoke remedies actually worked, even if the theoretical explanations were completely wrong. When you burn eucalyptus and breathe its vapour, your congested sinuses do clear, not because you're balancing humours or adjusting your key, but because eucalyptol is a genuine expectorant and decongestant. Ancient physicians didn't need to understand the chemistry to observe that it worked and to incorporate it into their practice. Some ancient smoke therapies were surprisingly sophisticated. Greek and Roman physicians developed fumigation tents where patients with respiratory problems could sit surrounded by therapeutic smoke from carefully chosen herbs. The dosage could be controlled by adjusting ventilation. The duration of treatment was specified precisely, and patients were monitored for adverse reactions. In ancient Persia, physicians at the famous medical school in Gundashapur compiled extensive pharmacopoeias that included detailed descriptions of therapeutic smoking. They categorized hundreds of plants by their effects when burned and inhaled, creating reference works that physicians could consult when treating specific conditions. The sensory experience of these treatments would have been significant in itself. Imagine suffering from some chronic condition, joint pain, respiratory problems, or digestive issues, and being prescribed a treatment that involves sitting in a warm room filled with aromatic smoke while a physician monitors your response. The relaxation induced by the setting, the attention from a respected healer, and the pleasant smell of the burning herbs, all of these factors would work together to produce what modern medicine calls placebo effects, though that term doesn't quite capture the complexity of what's happening. Because here's the thing about placebo effects. They're real. When your brain believes healing is occurring, it triggers physiological processes that promote actual healing. Stress hormones decrease, immune function improves, pain perception changes. The ancient physicians may not have understood the mechanisms, but they understood that healing involved the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, and that therapeutic smoke could address all three aspects simultaneously. While physicians were refining therapeutic smoke into a medical art and priests were perfecting incense rituals, merchants were creating networks that would carry aromatic substances across continents and oceans. These trade routes, particularly the famous Silk Road and the maritime spice routes, didn't just transport goods. They carried knowledge, practices, and entire cultural traditions around smoke and its uses. Picture yourself as a merchant in a caravan travelling the Silk Road around 200 CE. You've been on the road for months, moving slowly from oasis to oasis across the heart of Asia. Your camels are loaded with various goods, but the most valuable items are small, light, and incredibly expensive. Resins, herbs, and aromatic woods that will eventually be burned in temples, palaces, and wealthy homes across the known world. The economics of the incense trade were fascinating and sometimes absurd. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from trees in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, could increase in value by a factor of 50 or more by the time they reached Rome or Shangan. Merchants could become wealthy from a single successful caravan, though they could also lose everything to bandits, sandstorms, or simple miscalculations about market demand. But these merchants were carrying more than commodities. At each stop along the route, they shared information about how different cultures used aromatic smoke. A Buddhist technique for burning incense learned in India might be combined with Chinese theories about herbal properties and Persian aesthetic preferences to create something entirely new. The Silk Road was like a massive, slow-motion cultural blender, mixing practices and beliefs about smoke into increasingly complex combinations. Consider sandalwood, that aromatic wood from India that has been prized for thousands of years. In its homeland, sandalwood was primarily a religious substance, burned in Hindu and Buddhist temples to purify space and honour the divine. But as it travelled along trade routes, it acquired new uses and meanings. Chinese Buddhists adopted sandalwood incense but integrated it with Taoist practices and Confucian aesthetics. Japanese culture eventually transformed incense appreciation into kodo, literally the way of incense, a ceremonial art form as refined as tea ceremony. Islamic cultures incorporated sandalwood into their own devotional practices, while developing new combinations with rose, oud, and other aromatics. Christian churches began using it as an alternative to frankincense. The same substance, moving through different cultural contexts, became multiple different things while remaining itself. This is one of smoke's interesting properties. It's concrete enough to be a definite substance with specific effects, but ephemeral enough to acquire whatever symbolic meanings humans want to project onto it. The maritime spice routes that connected the Indian Ocean world were equally important for spreading smoke culture. Arab traders sailing from East Africa to India to Southeast Asia carried not just cinnamon, cloves and pepper, but also knowledge about aromatics and their uses. An Indonesian method for processing benzoin resin might be combined with Indian Ayurvedic theories and Arab perfumery techniques to create new products and practices. Some of these aromatic substances travelled astonishing distances. Camphor from Borneo found its way to Chinese temples and European apothecaries. Aloes wood from Southeast Asia became prized in Middle Eastern palaces. Dragon's blood resin from the Socotra Islands off Yemen travelled to China, India, Rome, and eventually medieval Europe. Each substance carried with it stories, practices, and beliefs about smoke and its properties. The traders themselves often became experts in aromatic substances. They needed to know not just market prices, but also how to identify genuine materials versus adulterations, how to store and transport delicate resins without losing their aromatic properties, and what different customers in different regions preferred. A successful incense merchant was part chemist, part cultural anthropologist, and part logistics expert. These trade routes also spread technologies for using aromatic smoke. The censer designs we discussed earlier, those specialised containers for burning incense, evolved through contact between different cultures. Chinese designs influenced Persian metalwork. Indian temple practices inspired Southeast Asian Buddhist rituals. Arab innovations in perfumery influenced European approaches to aromatic substances. By the medieval period, you could track cultural influence by following incense practices. When you see a particular way of blending aromatics or a specific ritual use of smoke appearing in a new region, you're usually seeing evidence of trade contact and cultural exchange. Smoke became a marker of cultural connection, a visible sign that ideas and practices were flowing between regions. The economic importance of the incense trade also shaped political relationships. Control over frankincense and myrrh-producing regions was contested by various powers throughout ancient history. The Romans even launched military expeditions into Arabia, partly to try to control incense supplies and reduce the enormous costs they were paying to Arabian merchants. The expeditions failed. Desert warfare is hard, but the attempt shows just how valuable these aromatic substances had become. What's remarkable is that this vast, complex trade system existed primarily to serve human desires for pleasant smells and altered consciousness. Yes, some aromatic substances had important medicinal uses, and yes, incense played crucial roles in religious practices. But at its core, the incense trade existed because humans across cultures agreed that filling the air with fragrant smoke was worth enormous effort and expense. This tells us something about human priorities. We're not purely practical creatures focused only on immediate survival needs. We're also aesthetic beings who value beauty, pleasure, and experiences that transport us beyond ordinary consciousness. The ancient incense trade served these deeper human needs, and merchants became wealthy because they understood something essential about what humans want from life. By now, several thousand years into humanity's relationship with aromatic smoke, something interesting had happened. Smoke hadn't just become a tool or commodity, it had become a language, a system of symbols through which humans expressed ideas about the sacred, the mysterious, and the boundaries between different realms of existence. Let's explore how different cultures turned this physical phenomenon into metaphor, and how those metaphors shaped human understanding of consciousness, divinity, and the structure of reality itself. Start in ancient Mesopotamia, that cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Babylonians and Assyrians burned incense in their temples, but they also carefully observed the patterns smoke made as it rose. Specialized priests, Baru they were called, practiced divination by smoke, reading messages from the gods in how incense smoke curled, drifted, or suddenly changed direction. This wasn't as arbitrary as it might sound. Smoke is exquisitely sensitive to air currents, temperature gradients, and subtle environmental factors that human senses can't directly detect. The Baru were essentially using smoke as a visualization tool for invisible atmospheric conditions, then interpreting these patterns according to complex symbolic systems that had been refined over generations. They were wrong about the God sending messages, but right that smoke reveals information about the environment that would otherwise be hidden. The symbolism was clear. Smoke connects the visible and invisible, the known and unknown. It emerges from the solid matter of incense or herbs, transforms into something ethereal, and disappears into air, travelling perhaps to realms beyond human perception. This made smoke a perfect metaphor for the soul's journey after death, for prayers seeking divine attention, and for any movement between material and spiritual realms. In ancient China, smoke took on different but related meanings. Taoist philosophers watched incense smoke rising in temples and saw lessons about the nature of reality. The smoke follows its nature, they noted. It doesn't try to be anything other than what it is, doesn't resist its own transformation from visible to invisible, and doesn't cling to any particular form or place. This made smoke a teaching tool about wu wei, effortless action, and about accepting change rather than fighting it. Chinese poets wrote extensively about incense smoke, using it as a metaphor for everything from romantic longing to political frustration to the transience of life itself. Li Bai, one of China's greatest poets, wrote about smoke from his incense burner twisting like dragon shapes, connecting his writing desk to the realm of immortals. The smoke wasn't just decoration. It was a visual representation of the connection between mundane reality and transcendent experience that poetry sought to capture. In India, smoke symbolism became deeply embedded in both Hindu and Buddhist practice. The Sanskrit word dhuma, smoke, appears in countless religious texts, usually associated with transformation, purification, and the transition between states. When a Hindu cremation releases smoke into the sky, that smoke represents the deceased's essence beginning its journey to whatever comes next. When Buddhist monks burn incense, the rising smoke visualizes the rise of merit from good actions, the dispersion of negative karma, and the movement of consciousness toward enlightenment. The Buddha himself apparently used smoke as a teaching metaphor. In various sutras, he compared clinging to impermanent things to trying to grasp smoke. The harder you squeeze, the faster it escapes, and you're left with nothing but perhaps a lingering smell on your hands. The lesson was about non-attachment, about recognizing that everything like smoke is temporary and cannot be possessed. Native American cultures developed their own rich smoke symbolism, though we should be careful here about generalizing across hundreds of distinct cultures. Many groups use smoke from sacred plants, tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, in ways that combined practical purposes with deep symbolic meaning. Smoke might purify a space, carry prayers to the spirit world, mark the boundaries of sacred ground, or seal agreements between peoples. The peace pipe, sage, and/or ceremonial pipe. Traditions found in many North American cultures treated smoke as a covenant mediator. When former enemies shared smoke from the same pipe, they were creating a physical and symbolic bond. The smoke they exhaled had been inside their bodies, mingling with their breath and blood. Sharing that smoke meant sharing something essential. Breaking an agreement made over the pipe wasn't just political betrayal, it was spiritual violation. In Islamic cultures, smoke acquired meanings related to both beauty and transcendence. Persian poetry frequently mentioned incense smoke as a symbol of devotion, longing, and the attempt to reach beyond material limitations. Sufi mystics sometimes used aromatic smoke as part of their practices, seeing in its rising movement an image of the soul's aspiration toward God. The best smoke, pure, fragrant, rising straight and true, represented the ideal spiritual state. Medieval European Christianity inherited its smoke symbolism partly from Jewish temple traditions and partly from broader Mediterranean cultures. The smoke of incense in a cathedral represented prayers rising to heaven, but it also had more practical symbolic functions. It marked sacred space as distinct from ordinary space, created an atmosphere for experiences of the numinous, and literally illustrated theological concepts about mediation between human and divine realms. The writers of medieval mystical texts often used smoke as a metaphor for spiritual experiences that couldn't be captured in ordinary language. How do you describe a vision of God? It's like seeing through smoke. You perceive something. You know something is there, but you can't make out clear details and the experience is inherently transitory. Smoke became the language for describing encounters with the ineffable. What's interesting across all these traditions is how smoke's physical properties, its visibility combined with intangibility, its upward movement, and its gradual dissolution, made it almost universally available as a metaphor for similar concepts. Different cultures didn't arrive at identical smoke symbolism, but there are striking parallels in how humans have interpreted this phenomenon. The colour of smoke also acquired symbolic meanings. White smoke was generally positive, pure, clean, auspicious. Black smoke suggested something wrong, dangerous or malevolent. Grey smoke was ambiguous, neither clearly good nor bad. These colour associations weren't arbitrary. They related to what actually produces different coloured smoke. White smoke comes from clean burning aromatics, and black smoke from incomplete combustion or impure materials. Humans turned these practical observations into symbolic systems. Even the smell of smoke carried symbolic weight. Sweet smoke suggested divine presence, spiritual purity, or successful ritual. Acrid smoke indicated something gone wrong, either in the physical preparation of materials or, metaphorically, in the spiritual state of the people involved. Smell, that most primal and emotionally evocative of senses, became a way of evaluating the quality and success of smoke-based practices. While temples filled with incense smoke and physicians prescribed therapeutic fumigations, another tradition was developing, one more personal, more intimate, and more focused on individual consciousness than collective ritual. This was the tradition of smoking from pipes, a practice that would eventually circle the globe and become one of humanity's most widespread ways of altering consciousness. The earliest pipes we know about come from various places and probably represent independent invention rather than diffusion from a single source. Ancient peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Americas all developed pipe technologies, though they used them for different substances and invested them with different meanings. Let's start in the Americas, where tobacco was first domesticated and smoking first became a complex cultural practice. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous peoples throughout North and South America were cultivating tobacco and developing elaborate technologies and rituals around smoking it. But here's something that often gets misunderstood. These weren't casual recreational practices. When a Mayan priest smoked tobacco through a long reed tube, or when a Cherokee elder filled a ceremonial pipe with sacred tobacco mixed with other herbs, they were engaging in religious practice as serious as any temple ceremony. The smoke from these pipes was medicine, sacrament, and diplomatic tool all rolled into one. The physical experience of smoking tobacco through a pipe would have been intense, far more so than modern cigarettes. Ancient tobacco varieties were significantly stronger than modern breeds, and pipe smoking delivers nicotine more efficiently than modern smoking methods. The immediate effects, mild euphoria, slight nausea, dizziness, altered perception, would have reinforced the sense that something spiritually significant was occurring. Native American pipe traditions often treated the pipe itself as sacred. Materials were chosen carefully, certain woods, specific stones, and decorations that carried symbolic meaning. The process of filling, lighting, and smoking the pipe followed prescribed patterns. Smoke might be offered to the four directions, to the earth and sky, or to ancestors or spirits. The entire practice was choreographed to create an experience that was simultaneously physical, the nicotine effects, social, pipes were often smoked communally, and spiritual, the ceremonial context provided meaning. In Asia, different pipe traditions developed around different substances. Chinese and Southeast Asian opium pipes represented a fascinating case study in how substance, technology, and culture interact. Opium smoking, which became widespread in China during the 17th and 18th centuries, required specialized equipment and technique. The pipes were often works of art. Bamboo stems with ceramic bowls, sometimes decorated with intricate carvings or inlays. The opium smoking ritual was elaborate. The opium had to be prepared. Cooked, cleaned, formed into pills. The pipe had to be held at the correct angle over a lamp. The smoker had to know exactly how to heat the opium pill and when to inhale. Done correctly, the process produced a distinctive sweet smell and a wave of relaxation that opium users described as like floating on a warm sea. We should note here that opium addiction became a severe social problem in 19th century China, with devastating consequences for individuals and society. But understanding the appeal requires acknowledging the sensory and psychological attractions of the practice, the ritual, the taste, the immediate relief from pain or anxiety, and cleaned, and the temporary escape from difficult lives. In the Middle East and Central Asia, water pipes, hookahs or nargilas, evolved as a way to smoke tobacco and other substances with some of the harshness filtered out. The hookah represents sophisticated engineering. Smoke is drawn through water, which cools it and removes some irritants, then through a long tube to the smoker's mouth. Multiple people can smoke from the same hookah simultaneously, making it a social technology as much as a drug delivery system. Hookah smoking in traditional Middle Eastern culture was a leisurely practice associated with coffee houses, intellectual discussion, and unhurried socializing. You didn't just smoke a hookah, you spent an evening at a hookah lounge talking philosophy or politics or everyday concerns with friends while sharing flavoured tobacco smoke that tasted of apple, rose, or other aromatics. The practice created a specific kind of social space, slightly removed from ordinary time, where conversation could wander and people could relax. European and American pipe smoking traditions, which developed primarily in the 16th through 19th centuries, created their own cultures around the practice. Clay pipes, then briar pipes, became technologies of contemplation, the ritual of choosing a tobacco blend, filling the pipe properly, lighting it with care and maintaining the burn through strategic puffing. These actions required attention and provided structure for thinking. Many scholars, writers, and artists described pipe smoking as an aid to concentration and creativity. The gentle stimulation from nicotine, combined with the meditative quality of the ritual and the pleasant taste of good tobacco, created conditions that many found conducive to intellectual work. This wasn't just justification for a habit. There's evidence that moderate nicotine intake can enhance certain cognitive functions, particularly sustained attention. The pipe itself became a symbol in European and American culture of masculinity, intellectuality, leisure, or contemplation, depending on context. Sherlock Holmes's pipe suggested his analytical mind. Father Christmas's pipe represented jolly contentment. The pipe-smoking professor became such a cultural archetype that even people who never smoked recognized the stereotype. What united all these different pipe traditions, from Amazonian tobacco to Asian opium to European briar pipes, was the intimate, personal quality of the experience. Unlike temple incense that filled a large space for many people, unlike physicians' fumigations administered as treatment, pipe smoking was about individual consciousness, personal ritual, and chosen moments of altered awareness. The pipe created a small, immediate relationship between a person and smoke. You controlled every aspect: what you smoked, when you smoked, and how much you smoked. The smoke filled your mouth, touched your tongue, and entered your lungs, or in some traditions was only taken into the mouth. It was yours in a way that communal smoke wasn't. This personal quality made pipes attractive for contemplation, for marking transitions between activities, and for creating small islands of ritual in otherwise unstructured time. You could smoke a pipe while thinking through a problem, while grieving a loss, while celebrating a success, or while simply watching the sunset. The smoke became a companion to your thoughts, a physical manifestation of the moment you were inhabiting. Different cultures developed different etiquettes around pipe smoking. In some Native American traditions, interrupting someone who was smoking would be deeply disrespectful. The act demanded its own time and space. In Victorian England, pipe smoking was gendered male and confined to specific rooms or times, creating a whole architecture of social rules about where and when smoke was appropriate. In Middle Eastern coffee houses, hookah smoking was communal and conversational. The pipe passed between friends as freely as words. The sensory experience of pipe smoking varied enormously, depending on what was being smoked and how. Tobacco could be sweet or harsh, smooth or biting, aromatic or plain. Opium produced a distinctive smell that became associated with relaxation and escape. Cannabis, which has been smoked in various forms for thousands of years, offered yet another sensory profile, earthier and more pungent than tobacco, with quite different effects on consciousness. What's interesting is how quickly pipe smoking spread once global trade networks emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. Tobacco, which was completely unknown outside the Americas before 1492, had reached every inhabited continent within a century of European contact with the New World. Pipes appeared in Africa, Asia, Europe and Oceania with remarkable speed, suggesting that the practice answered some widespread human need or desire. This rapid spread wasn't just about nicotine addiction, though that certainly played a role. It was also about the appeal of a personal ritual that could create moments of calm in increasingly complex, connected and demanding societies. As the world modernized, as traditional rhythms of agricultural life gave way to urban industrial time, the pipe offered a portable, personal technology for creating small moments of peace. Now we approach more recent history, that period from roughly 1700 to 1900, when the practices we've been discussing underwent significant transformation. The scientific revolution was changing how educated people understood smoke and its effects. Industrialization was changing how aromatic substances were produced and distributed. Colonialism was disrupting traditional practices while spreading them to new contexts. Let's consider how European expansion affected incense traditions worldwide. When Portuguese traders reached India and Southeast Asia, when Spanish conquistadors encountered American civilizations, and when Dutch merchants established themselves in Indonesia, they found elaborate, sophisticated traditions around aromatic smoke. Some of these traditions they adopted, others they disrupted, and still others they tried to suppress. Christian missionaries, for instance, often viewed indigenous smoking practices with deep suspicion. Shamanic tobacco use in the Americas looked disturbingly like religious ritual, which of course it was, and missionaries worked to suppress it as paganism. But they had no problem with incense in their own churches, which was also a religious smoke ritual, but properly Christian and therefore acceptable. This selective acceptance and rejection created interesting hybrid practices. In Latin America, indigenous smoking traditions mixed with Catholic incense used to create something new. In India, Hindu incense practices continued but also influenced British colonial culture. By the Victorian era, wealthy British homes routinely burned Indian incense, though usually stripped of their original religious meanings and appreciated primarily for their exotic fragrance. The scientific study of smoke and its effects began in earnest during this period. Chemists started analysing the compounds in various aromatic substances, identifying specific molecules responsible for particular smells or effects. Physicians began conducting something resembling clinical trials, testing whether therapeutic smoking actually worked for the conditions it was prescribed to treat. Some traditional smoke remedies held up reasonably well under scientific scrutiny. Yes, eucalyptus smoke does help respiratory problems. We can now explain exactly why in terms of chemical constituents and their interactions with human respiratory tissues. Other traditional practices didn't fare as well. No, smoke from burnt goat hair will not cure epilepsy, regardless of what ancient physicians believed. But this scientific understanding also stripped smoke of much of its mystery and symbolic power. When aromatic smoke becomes merely a delivery mechanism for specific chemical compounds, it loses something of its capacity to carry meanings beyond the physical. The rationalization of smoke knowledge made practices more effective in some ways, while making them less meaningful in others. Industrialization changed the incense trade dramatically. Instead of rare resins carried across continents by caravan, aromatic substances could be synthesized in factories, or at least mass-produced from plantation-grown materials. This made incense much cheaper and more widely available, which was good for access, but not so good for the sense of precious rarity that had surrounded aromatics for thousands of years. The 19th century also saw increasing concerns about smoking's health effects. Physicians who had once prescribed therapeutic smoking began noticing that heavy smokers seemed to develop distinctive health problems. The connection between tobacco and various diseases was beginning to be recognised, though it would take until the mid-20th century before the full scope of smoking's health impacts became clear. This created an interesting divergence. Temple incense and aromatic smoke for atmosphere remained relatively uncontroversial. People recognised you weren't inhaling enough smoke in these contexts to cause health problems. But pipe smoking, and especially cigarette smoking, came under increasing scrutiny as evidence mounted that regular smoke inhalation damaged lungs and contributed to various diseases. The cigarette, which became dominant in the 20th century, represented a departure from older smoking traditions in important ways. Cigarettes were industrial products, uniform, mass-produced, and designed for quick consumption rather than contemplative ritual. The cigarette break replaced the pipe smoking session. Same basic activity but compressed, hurried, and stripped of most ceremonial elements. Where pipe smoking had required some skill and attention, you had to pack the pipe properly, keep it lit, and manage the ash. Cigarette smoking was nearly effortless. Strike a match, inhale, exhale, repeat. This ease of use contributed to much higher consumption rates and consequently much worse health outcomes. The cigarette was smoke practice optimized for nicotine delivery, rather than for ritual, contemplation, or social bonding. Yet even cigarettes acquired their own rituals and meanings. The sharing of cigarettes between soldiers created bonds. The offered cigarette became a social gesture. The lighting of someone else's cigarette had its own etiquette, and even romantic connotations. Humans, it seems, will create ritual around any repeated practice, even industrial ones. Meanwhile, incense traditions continue to evolve in various directions. In Japan, kodo, the way of incense, became increasingly refined as an aesthetic practice, separate from religious contexts. Practitioners learned to distinguish hundreds of different aromatic woods, to appreciate subtle differences in fragrance, and to use incense as a focus for meditation and mindfulness. It was like wine tasting, but for smoke, and equally sophisticated. In India, the ancient traditions of incense making continued, but also adapted to modern commerce. Factories in cities like Bangalore produced incense sticks in enormous quantities, maintaining traditional formulations while using modern manufacturing techniques. The smell of jasmine or sandalwood incense became associated with Indian culture generally. Carried worldwide by the Indian diaspora, Western counterculture movements in the 1960s and 70s rediscovered incense and brought it into mainstream Euro-American culture. Young people burning Nag Champa in their apartments were participating, often unknowingly, in smoke traditions that stretched back thousands of years. The context had changed, Bohemian flats rather than ancient temples, but the basic practice of filling a space with aromatic smoke remained the same. This period also saw renewed interest in indigenous smoking practices, particularly ayahuasca ceremonies and similar traditions. Some of this interest was respectful and carefully conducted. Some of it amounted to cultural appropriation, with sacred practices stripped from their original context and treated as recreational drug use. The distinction matters. There's a difference between participating meaningfully in a tradition and simply consuming exotic experiences. As you nestle deeper into your blankets and perhaps notice how your own breathing has slowed while reading this story, let's turn to what modern science has discovered about why smoke-based practices affect us the way they do. Understanding the mechanisms doesn't diminish the experience. If anything, it reveals how intuitive our ancestors were in their observations. The human olfactory system, your sense of smell, is directly connected to the limbic system, those ancient structures deep in your brain that process emotion and memory. This is why certain smells can instantly transport you to childhood, evoke powerful emotional responses, or create immediate feelings of calm or anxiety. When you smell incense or aromatic smoke, the molecules trigger not just sensory perception, but emotional and memory responses that bypass conscious reasoning. Ancient peoples didn't know about the limbic system. but they certainly knew that certain smells made them feel certain ways. They were working with the same neurological architecture we have today, conducting empirical experiments and altering their own consciousness and carefully noting which plants produced which effects. Modern chemistry has identified the specific compounds responsible for many traditional incense effects. Frankincense contains boswellic acids and other molecules that have genuine anti-inflammatory and anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing properties. When burned, frankincense releases these compounds in a form that can be absorbed through the respiratory system, producing measurable effects on brain chemistry and emotional state. Lavender smoke contains linalool and linaloyl acetate, compounds that have been shown in laboratory studies to reduce stress hormones and promote relaxation. The Greeks and Romans, who burned lavender to promote calmness, weren't just engaging in superstition. They were using a substance that genuinely affects human neurobiology in ways that reduce anxiety. Similarly, the therapeutic smoking practices of ancient physicians often prescribed genuinely effective substances. When Chinese doctors recommended smoking mahuang for respiratory problems, they were unknowingly prescribing ephedrine, a powerful bronchodilator. When Indian Ayurvedic physicians prescribed cannabis smoke for various conditions, they were using a substance with documented effects on pain, nausea, and several other symptoms. Modern neuroscience has also helped explain why ritual and setting matter so much for smoke-based practices. The brain doesn't just respond to chemical compounds, it responds to expectations, context, and meaning. When you burn incense in a context you've learned to associate with relaxation or spiritual experience, your brain begins producing the associated response before you've even inhaled any smoke. This isn't just psychological, by the way. The expectation of relaxation triggers real, measurable changes in brain chemistry, increased serotonin and dopamine, and decreased cortisol and adrenaline. The chemical compounds in the smoke then enhance and extend these changes, creating a synergistic effect that's more powerful than either context or chemistry alone. Breathing patterns matter too, and this is something ancient practitioners understood intuitively. When you deliberately slow and deepen your breathing to inhale aromatic smoke, you're activating your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode that counteracts stress responses. The compounds in the smoke enhance this effect, but the breathing pattern itself is doing significant work. This explains why similar practices emerged in different cultures. Humans everywhere have the same basic neurobiology, the same limbic system responses to aromatic compounds, and the same parasympathetic relaxation response to slow breathing. Ancient peoples in China, India, Rome, and the Americas independently discovered that burning certain plants and breathing the smoke deeply produced specific desirable effects because they were all working with the same human hardware. Modern research has also revealed some unexpected benefits of certain aromatic compounds. Rosemary smoke, for instance, contains molecules that appear to enhance memory and cognitive function. Studies have shown that people performing memory tasks in rooms scented with rosemary perform better than control groups. Ancient peoples who burned rosemary while studying or before important meetings may have been unwittingly using a genuine cognitive enhancer. Interestingly, the communal aspects of smoke practices also have measurable effects. When people participate in shared rituals, whether religious incense ceremonies or communal pipe smoking, their stress hormones decrease, their sense of social connection increases, and various measures of well-being improve. The smoke is part of this, but so is the ritual itself, the shared experience, and the sense of participating in something larger than yourself. The placebo effects we mentioned earlier turn out to be far more complex and interesting than once thought. Modern research shows that placebo responses involve genuine changes in neurotransmitter levels, immune function, and even gene expression. When ancient healers conducted elaborate smoke rituals for sick patients, they were triggering healing responses that were as real as any pharmaceutical effect, even if the mechanisms were completely different from what the healers believed. There are also risks, and modern science has made these clearer than ever. Regular smoke inhalation, regardless of the substance, damages respiratory tissues and increases risks of various cancers and lung diseases. The difference between occasional ceremonial incense exposure and daily tobacco smoking is enormous in terms of health outcomes, but even aromatic smoke in high concentrations can be problematic for people with respiratory conditions. This creates an interesting tension. The practices we've been discussing do have genuine effects, psychological, neurological and social, but they also carry risks that increase with frequency and intensity of use. Ancient peoples generally used these practices more sparingly than modern recreational smokers, which likely limited health impacts while preserving the ritual and psychological benefits. The modern scientific understanding of smoke and its effects suggests that our ancestors were remarkably sophisticated observers of human consciousness and the substances that alter it. They couldn't explain the mechanisms in terms of neurotransmitters and receptor sites, but they could reliably predict that burning substance X in context Y would produce effect Z. That's empirical science, even without the theoretical frameworks we've added. Now, as we move into the present day, the story of smoke becomes more personal and immediate. You might have your own experiences with incense, with the smell of wood smoke from a fireplace, with the lingering aroma of sage or sweet grass, or with memories attached to particular scents that rise in curling wisps. The relationship between modern people and aromatic smoke is complicated, full of contradictions that would have baffled our ancestors. We know more about the chemistry and health effects than any previous generation, yet we often use this knowledge poorly. We have access to aromatics from around the world at prices that would astound ancient merchants, yet we often fail to appreciate the depth of traditions behind them. Walk into most metaphysical bookstores, yoga studios or wellness centres in the Western world, and you'll find incense for sale, often nag champa from India, but also white sage bundles, palo santo sticks, copal resin, and various other aromatics from traditions worldwide. This represents unprecedented access to global smoke traditions, but also raises questions about cultural appropriation, sustainable harvesting, and whether transplanted practices retain their meaning outside their original contexts. The white sage situation is particularly instructive. White sage is sacred to various Native American peoples, particularly in California and the Southwest. Smudging with white sage, burning bundles of the dried herb to purify spaces, is an important practice in these traditions. But commercial harvesting has put white sage populations under pressure, and seeing their sacred plant sold in every New Age shop understandably bothers many Native Americans. This is the smoke tradition encountering globalization, and it's complicated. On one hand, people worldwide seeking calm and purification through aromatic smoke are participating in fundamentally human practices that transcend culture. On the other hand, there's something troubling about sacred traditions being commodified and stripped of their contexts. The smoke remains the same, but the meanings change in translation. Meanwhile, incense traditions in their homelands continue to evolve. Visit a Buddhist temple in Taiwan, Thailand, or Japan, and you'll find practices that combine ancient formulations with modern sensibilities. The incense might be made using traditional recipes, but manufactured in climate-controlled facilities, with quality testing that ensures consistent products. The rituals continue, but in buildings that have electric lights, air conditioning, and live stream services for distant devotees. In India, the incense industry has become a significant economic sector, employing thousands of people in traditional craft manufacturing that's been modernized without being completely industrialized. Families that have made incense for generations now export their products globally, while maintaining recipes and techniques passed down through the centuries. It's tradition adapting to modernity, finding ways to continue that don't require rejecting change entirely. The medical use of aromatic smoke has largely disappeared in developed countries, replaced by more reliable pharmaceutical approaches. Your doctor isn't going to prescribe therapeutic fumigation for your respiratory infection. They'll give you antibiotics or antivirals. But aromatherapy, the use of essential oils and aromatic compounds for psychological and mild physical benefits, has found a niche as complementary medicine. Essential oil diffusers represent an interesting evolution of smoke practice. Instead of burning aromatic substances, these devices vaporize essential oils in water, creating a fragrant mist that disperses through a room. It's smoke without combustion, aromatics without ash, and a sanitised version of ancient practices adapted for modern homes that have smoke detectors and fire codes. Does it work? Yes and no. The aromatic compounds still affect the limbic system, still produce psychological responses, and still create pleasant environments. But something is lost when you remove the visual element of smoke rising, the slight edge of danger from working with fire, and the ritualised aspects of preparing and lighting incense. The diffuser is more convenient and probably safer, but convenience and safety aren't the only values that matter. The cigarette culture that dominated much of the 20th century is finally declining as health consequences become undeniable, and social acceptance evaporates. Fewer people smoke cigarettes now than at any time since the 1920s in most developed countries. This is undoubtedly good for public health, but it's also removed one of the few remaining widespread smoke practices from everyday life. Some of this void is being filled by cannabis legalization in various jurisdictions. As cannabis becomes legal for recreational use, new traditions and practices are emerging around its consumption. Some of these echo older traditions. The passed joint as a social bonding ritual has parallels to passed pipes in various cultures. Others are distinctly modern, vaporizers and edibles representing approaches to cannabis consumption that minimize or eliminate smoke entirely. The use of incense in religious and spiritual contexts continues worldwide, relatively unchanged by modernity's other transformations. Walk into a Catholic church during High Mass, visit a Hindu temple during puja, or attend a Buddhist meditation session, you'll encounter aromatic smoke being used for purposes that would be instantly recognizable to practitioners from centuries ago. This continuity is remarkable given how much else has changed. Interestingly, there's been a modern revival of interest in contemplative practices generally, and incense has followed along. Mindfulness meditation, which has become surprisingly mainstream in secular Western culture, often incorporates incense as a focus for attention or simply as atmosphere. The practice has been stripped of religious associations, but retains the basic insight that aromatic smoke can help create mental states conducive to calm awareness. The Japanese incense ceremony, Kodo, has even found adherents outside Japan, though whether these practitioners fully appreciate the aesthetic and philosophical depths of the tradition is debatable. Still, the fact that people are willing to spend hours learning to distinguish subtle differences in aromatic woods suggests that ancient approaches to smoke appreciation can still resonate with modern sensibilities. Environmental concerns are adding new dimensions to how we think about smoke. Burning incense or anything else releases particulate matter and various chemicals into the air. Indoor air quality has become a recognised health concern, and burning substances indoors regularly isn't great for it. This creates another tension. The practices that brought calm to countless generations now face questions about whether they're worth the environmental and health costs. There's also the simple fact that many modern people don't know how to safely work with fire. We've outsourced flame to gas stoves, furnaces and pilot lights, controlled, automatic, requiring no attention. The idea of deliberately lighting something on fire and managing it while it burns is foreign to people who've grown up with smoke detectors that sound at the first hint of combustion. Ancient practices assume a comfort level with fire that many modern people simply lack, yet the fundamental human responses to aromatic smoke haven't changed. When you smell sandalwood or frankincense, your brain processes it using the same neural pathways that lit up in an ancient Egyptian's brain. When you watch smoke curl and rise, you're seeing the same patterns that fascinated Mesopotamian diviners. When you associate certain smells with calm or contemplation, you're participating in conditioning processes that humans have been using for millennia. As we approach the end of our journey through smoke's history, it's worth pausing to reflect on why this matters. Why the story of humanity's relationship with aromatic smoke deserves telling, and what it reveals about who we are as a species. At the most basic level, the story of smoke is a story about human curiosity and experimentation. Our ancestors didn't have to figure out that burning certain plants produced pleasant or interesting effects. They could have just burned whatever wood was convenient and been content with warmth and light. But humans don't work that way. We experiment, observe, remember, and refine. We notice patterns and explore possibilities. We turn accidental discoveries into deliberate practices. The fact that humans in wildly different cultures independently discovered similar uses for aromatic smoke tells us something about universal human needs. Across every continent, in climates from Arctic to tropical, people sought ways to alter consciousness, create sacred space, mark important moments, find relief from pain or anxiety, and connect with something beyond everyday reality. Smoke became one tool among many for meeting these needs. This suggests that the desire for altered consciousness isn't a pathology or a weakness, but a fundamental aspect of human psychology. We're not meant to exist in one constant state. We need variety in our experiences, access to different modes of consciousness, and ways to step outside ordinary perception and see from different angles. Aromatic smoke provided this for most of human history, which is why its practices spread so widely and persisted so long. The story of smoke is also a story about the tension between material and meaning. Smoke is a physical phenomenon, combustion, producing particulate matter suspended in air. But humans have never been content to treat it as merely physical. We've invested smoke with meanings, used it as a language for concepts that can't be expressed in words alone, and made it carry our hopes and prayers to realms we can't directly perceive. This capacity to see beyond the purely physical, to find meaning in natural phenomena, to create symbol systems that let us think about abstract concepts, this is distinctly human. Other animals might enjoy pleasant smells, but only humans burn aromatics in specific contexts to deliberately alter their mental states, while simultaneously expressing spiritual beliefs through the act itself. The global spread of smoke traditions through trade routes tells us something about human connectivity. We tend to think of ancient peoples as isolated in their own cultures, but the fact that frankincense from southern Arabia ended up in Chinese temples, that tobacco from the Americas reached Asia within decades, and that incense formulas spread across continents. All this reveals networks of human connection that were surprisingly robust and far-reaching. These trade networks weren't just about economics. They were about shared human experiences, about the recognition that people in distant lands were seeking similar things: calm, transcendence, healing, and connection to the divine. The merchant who carried frankincense from Arabia to Rome was carrying more than a commodity. They were carrying one culture's approach to these universal needs and introducing it to people who would adapt it to their own purposes. The evolution of smoke practices over time shows human creativity and adaptability. The same basic principle, burning aromatic substances and breathing or being present with the smoke, has been endlessly varied and refined. From cave fires to temple censers, to ceremonial pipes to modern incense sticks. Humans have found countless ways to engage with this simple practice, each variation reflecting different values, technologies, and cultural contexts. There's something deeply democratic about smoke practices. Unlike some technologies that require rare materials or expert knowledge, almost anyone can burn aromatic substances and benefit from the experience. Yes, there are elaborate traditions that require years to master, but the basic practice is accessible to everyone. This accessibility helps explain why smoke practices spread so widely and persisted across huge differences in wealth, power, and social organisation. The modern decline of some smoke traditions raises questions about what we're losing. Not just specific practices, but a whole way of engaging with consciousness, ritual, and the material world. When we replace incense with room deodorizers, when we substitute essential oil diffusers for censers, when we eliminate smoke practices entirely due to health concerns, what are we giving up along with what we gain? This isn't a call to reject modernity or ignore legitimate health concerns. But it is worth recognising that our ancestors' smoke practices emerged from and spoke to genuine human needs that don't disappear just because we've developed new technologies. The need for ritual, for moments of deliberate calm, for sensory experiences that anchor us in the present, these persist whether we acknowledge them or not. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how such a simple thing, aromatic smoke, could carry so much weight across so many cultures and so many centuries. We've developed incredibly sophisticated technologies, mapped the human genome, and sent probes to the edge of the solar system. Yet something as basic as burning aromatic resins and breathing the smoke can still produce experiences that modern science fully explains, but can't quite replicate through any other means. The smell of frankincense or sandalwood, the sight of smoke curling upward, the taste of aromatic vapour on your tongue. These experiences connect you directly to humans who lived thousands of years ago, who found in these same smells and sights access to states of consciousness they valued. It's a form of time travel, not through technology, but through shared experience across the centuries. As you finish this story and prepare for sleep, you might be more aware of the air you're breathing, the way scents linger in your room, and the quality of stillness that can settle over a space in the evening. These awarenesses are part of what smoke practices cultivated. Attention to subtle sensory experiences, recognition that the invisible can be as important as the visible, and understanding that consciousness is not fixed but fluid. The story of smoke is, in the end, your story too. Whether you've ever burned incense or not, whether you have any personal smoke practices or not, you're part of a species that has been exploring consciousness, seeking calm, and finding meaning in rising wisps for hundreds of thousands of years. That's worth remembering as you drift towards sleep. You're not separate from this history. You're its latest chapter, carrying forward patterns of human experience that stretch back to those first cave dwellers who threw aromatic branches on their fires and discovered that the world could suddenly seem different, more spacious and more full of possibility. The practices change, the substances vary, and the cultural context shift, but the underlying human impulses remain constant. We seek moments of peace in difficult times. We create rituals to mark the sacred and separate it from the mundane. We use our senses to anchor ourselves in the present moment. We explore altered states of consciousness because ordinary consciousness, while necessary, is not sufficient for a fully human life. Smoke, visible breath, transformation made tangible, the boundary between solid and air, serves all these purposes and more. It's been medicine and sacrament, recreation and therapy, art form and spiritual practice. It's linked distant cultures and revealed common humanity. It's been studied by scientists and mystics, sought by kings and available to peasants. Tomorrow you might smell wood smoke from a neighbour's fireplace, or incense from a nearby temple, or simply the lingering aroma of your evening tea. When you do, you might remember this story and recognise that you're experiencing something humans have found meaningful for longer than we've had written language. You might notice how the smell affects your mood, how your breathing changes, and how the moment feels slightly different from moments without that aromatic presence. Or you might not. You might simply go about your day, unaware of the ancient traditions playing out in the background of modern life. Either way, the smoke will continue to rise, carrying with it meanings and memories accumulated across millennia. The practices we've discussed face an uncertain future. Climate change, urbanization, health concerns and cultural shifts all challenge traditional smoke practices. Some will adapt and continue, others will fade, and new forms will emerge that we can't yet predict. But the human needs these practices address aren't going anywhere, which suggests that some form of smoke tradition will persist as long as humans do. Perhaps future historians will look back at our era as the moment when humanity's ancient relationship with aromatic smoke underwent its most dramatic transformation. Or perhaps they'll see our time as just another adaptation in an ongoing story that continues to unfold in ways both familiar and surprising. What we can say with certainty is that smoke has been a faithful companion to human consciousness for longer than any other deliberately sought altered state. Before alcohol fermentation, before plant cultivation, before writing or wheels or cities, humans were burning aromatic substances and discovering that the right smoke at the right time could open doors to experiences that made life more bearable and sometimes transcendent. That's not a small thing. That's evidence that humans have always been more than just survival machines focused on food, shelter, and reproduction. We're meaning-making creatures, consciousness-exploring animals, beings who seek not just to live but to experience living fully in all its varieties and depths. As you close your eyes and feel yourself beginning to drift into sleep, imagine for a moment all the people across all the centuries who have lain down at day's end with the smell of aromatic smoke still lingering in their awareness. Roman priestesses after a day of temple service, Chinese scholars after evening study sessions, Native American elders after ceremonial pipe sharing, medieval monks after evensong, Victorian gentlemen after contemplative pipe smoking. You're part of that vast, invisible community. All the humans who have sought and found moments of peace, insight, or transcendence through the simple act of being present with aromatic smoke. The specific practices differ, the beliefs vary, and the cultural contexts shift. But the experience connects you across time to countless others who breathed deeply, watched smoke rise, and felt something shift in their awareness. Sleep well, knowing that the air you breathe has carried not just oxygen but meaning for as long as humans have existed. The darkness that gathers around you as you sleep once glowed with firelight, and the stillness you enter was filled with the scent of sacred smoke. You're not alone in this moment. You're accompanied by ancestors beyond counting who found in smoke something worth preserving and passing down. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and joys, its own moments of stress and peace. But you'll carry with you now this story, this awareness that calm has always been available, that humans have always found ways to create space for reflection and renewal, and that something as simple as aromatic smoke has served as a bridge to better states of mind for longer than we can fully comprehend. And if you choose to light incense or simply notice the scent of wood smoke drifting past your window, you'll do so with deeper understanding of what you're participating in. Not just a personal preference or a pleasant smell, but a practice that connects you to the oldest, most persistent human traditions. The last ember glows, fades, and finally goes dark. The smoke rises one last time, thinning as it climbs, becoming invisible as it joins the air. The story continues, even as this telling ends. Rest now.